Hi everyone, it's Emma here, and this week I'm talking through 5 foods to avoid during your period. So this is a bit of a follow-on from last week where I was talking through foods or nutrients more specifically, and then foods that were containing those nutrients that may be helpful around the time of your period. And now I'm going to look at the other end of the spectrum and talk through some foods which might not be quite so helpful, particularly at this time of the month. So let's just get stuck straight in, and number one, I am going to talk about caffeine. So caffeine is more often found in drinks, but for me drinks are so important. I don't just talk about foods, and drinks are actually an area of our diet that we can quite often forget about, but can be super significant when we're looking towards managing symptoms. So caffeine, it's primarily found in coffee, but also in teas and other foods, fizzy drinks, for example, chocolate in small amounts as well. But particularly the teas and coffees, we can add quite a bit in without always being aware of it. So caffeine can affect us adversely for a number of reasons. It's quite stimulatory, stimulates our internal stress response, and this in result can have a number of effects on different hormones and things, specifically on our mood and our blood sugar levels as well. So quite quickly after having caffeine, your blood sugar rises, and this in turn can support your energy levels for a short time. But then we get this crash in our blood sugar and our energy levels sometime later, and that can also affect your mood as well. So of course this can happen at any time, but in the lead up to your period, when you're feeling a bit vulnerable anyway, this could potentially be especially tricky. So talking about those different sources of caffeine, there's also the fizzy drinks. So that's one to consider in terms of the caffeine content, but also there's artificial sweeteners in there, which can be quite problematic for your gut health in particular, as well as your blood sugar responses. And then there's excess gas in those fizzy juices as well, which could contribute to bloating, which again we might already be struggling with at this time of the month. All these options as well are quite pro-inflammatory, so they contain quite pro-inflammatory ingredients, and we talk a lot about how anti-inflammatory foods and drinks are so beneficial during this time to help counter those prostaglandins which are released from the lining of your womb during your period. In terms of a simple swap, if you've got quite a caffeine habit, I wouldn't expect you to swap, to cut all caffeine very quickly, but every little helps. Just even swapping 1 cup of tea or coffee a day, and finding an option that works well for you. If you like coffee, or bamboo is a particularly nice substitute. It's naturally caffeine free, it's made from different grains, but the taste is actually very reminiscent of coffee, so it's quite a nice substitute if the coffee is your go-to drink. Number 2 on my list is refined sources of sugar. So you might think, sugar, how much am I having? And you might think, it's just in sweet things, I'm not having that many. But actually sugar is the simplest unit of carbohydrates, and if you're having lots of refined carbs, so that's all your white carbohydrates, your bread, your pastas, your rice, lots of those quite white options that have been milled and refined down, then that sugar is quite easily made available and quite readily released, and that can cause a similar spike in your blood sugar as to that we described with the caffeine. So it's just all about considering your forms of carbohydrates and trying to go for those whole grain brown forms wherever possible. The interesting thing about sugar as well is it's often hidden in a lot of other options, not necessarily the sweet ones. So everything from tomato sauce to ready meals. We'll talk a bit more about the processed foods in a while, but it can be readily hidden. And it's not to say that we can't have carbohydrates or sugars, it's just all about balance. So again, trying to introduce more sources of protein and healthy fats just to counter the effects of any of those sugars and those very simple carbohydrates. Sugar again is quite stimulating, it's quite pro-inflammatory in that simple refined form, so it's good just to try and balance that with more anti-inflammatory options, just to balance those effects rather than worrying about cutting it out completely. Number 3 here we have fatty meat and fried foods. So this is all about, I mentioned healthy fats, but it's just then considering what types of fats you're having. So traditionally we've been quite wary of saturated fats, so that is still partly the advice, but what I would say is just to consider your sources of saturated fats. We're now starting to understand that within saturated fats there is actually some other subtypes. So what I say to look out for is to look out for lots of meat based sources of fat, so that kind of white fat that you see on meat. Also processed meat such as your sausages and burgers and bacon, they usually have lots more fat content in there as well. And then your fried foods as well, because we tend to use lower quality fats for that frying process. So these fats tend to be the oils we use for deep frying, for example, tend to be higher in omega-6 compared to omega-3. And omega-3 is a lovely anti-inflammatory, so it can just throw that ratio of the omega-6 to the omega-3 off. The omega-6 is generally much more pro-inflammatory, and again, that's where we can run into issues, and potentially we won't be able to counter the effects of those inflammatory prostaglandins so much, which can give rise to those cramps that many of us suffer from. So in terms of trying to reduce your inflammatory load in terms of those fats, we would be wanting to reduce fried foods, also just reducing especially processed meats, but just substituting in more vegetable and fish options which are going to be more guaranteed to be anti-inflammatory. Your oily fish is higher in omega-3 compared to omega-6, and the vegetarian options are generally lower in those saturated fats, although the plant-based saturated fats aren't thought to be quite so worrisome. Number 4, we have dairy. So again, I'm not saying to cut out things completely, but as individuals, there might just be a couple of categories of foods that you yourself could experiment with and might notice some improvements if you alter your intake. So for dairy, if you are having some dairy, I would say to go for good quality organic dairy. There is some research to suggest that dairy could potentially influence our hormones, especially at high amounts. So I would always opt for organic wherever possible to help reduce that concern. But also practically dairy and meats, which we've already mentioned, are slightly more taxing on the digestive system and the liver. They take slightly more effort to break down and absorb. The liver in particular is a key digestive organ, which is important for digestion, but also your liver is very important for metabolizing and excreting any excess hormones, such as estrogen. So that might be an issue, and the burden on the liver might just be a little bit too much. So anything we can do to reduce the burden on the liver may well be helpful. Another thing with dairy, people assume we need lots of calcium, so we need to eat lots of dairy. That's actually not really true in terms of dairy being the only source of calcium. It isn't at all, and in fact we can get plenty of calcium through our diet through vegetarian and vegan sources. So lots of your lovely leafy greens, your nuts, your seeds, your whole grains, all of these lovely fresh food options have lots of calcium in, so usually we can get enough calcium in our diet anyway. Also, we worry about calcium in terms of bone health, but actually other nutrients such as magnesium and vitamin D are equally important, if not even more important, for maintaining bone health. So magnesium, again, found in lots of your lovely whole foods. Plus, magnesium has so many other both physical and mental benefits during our monthly cycle. So I just wouldn't worry too much about having so much emphasis on the calcium there. There is other options, and of course other food sources other than your dairy. Final big category on my list is processed and salty foods. So I've mentioned a bit about the processed foods. The processed foods do seem to be probably the most problematic category of food for me for a number of reasons. So if you can do anything, it would be to reduce your intake of processed foods. We've talked about your refined carbohydrates, your poor quality fats, your artificial sweeteners. All of these are more likely to be in excess in processed foods, and salt is another category as well. Too much salt can easily make us feel quite bloated. We retain water, puts pressure on your kidneys. So all of these can add to the usual monthly symptoms. So being quite conscious of your salt intake is helpful, and the easiest way to do that is to manage your processed food intake. The majority of our salt intake is from processed foods. So that would be my tip, just to try and cook even an extra meal a week from fresh and take it from there, and that should naturally help to target your salt intake. Just a question here I asked, is chocolate okay around your period? So often we're craving a little bit of a comfort food, and people worry, will this be detrimental? Can I have a little bit of what I enjoy? Absolutely. For me, you can have a little bit of what you enjoy. Just some slight considerations if you're keen to enjoy it but not to kind of go for the healthier option. Good quality dark chocolate can be a really nice one to go to. Good quality chocolate coming from cocoa beans does actually contain some magnesium, so that is a benefit. But what happens is if we go for kind of cheaper, mass-produced lower quality chocolate, we tend to have more sugar and more dairy, more milk content in there, so it starts to take away from the benefits. So just something to consider, that a good quality, higher cocoa content chocolate would be the best option there. Just to wrap up, we talked a bit about which foods to include. So I will include the link for my full blog on this topic. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but I've just got some key go-to foods here in this blog here. So I've mentioned leafy greens, whole grains, oily fish and bananas. So these are just my top list of really nutrient dense anti-inflammatory foods. So I've talked about the processed foods. It's not just what we take out, it's also what we add back in. So these food groups in particular are so rich in lots of the lovely nutrients I've already mentioned, such as your magnesium, your potassium, your vitamin D, and these are key nutrients that are going to help support the symptoms of PMS. Omega-3 in your oily fish is another one, hugely anti-inflammatory, and research there to suggest that it could be helpful. Just one final note from me, we've talked a lot about food and all the nutrients to help. Please note, if there is an underlying hormone imbalance, sometimes a herbal remedy may just be the step up you need to help really get to the bottom of that. So that would be something when, like your agnus castus, that situation would be when something like your agnus castus would come in. So this would be to help target an underlying hormone imbalance, such as one of those associated with PMS. The agnus castus, you should take it every single day of your cycle, and for at least 2 to 4 months for best effects as well. So that would be just a little bit of a step up once you've made all those dietary changes and perhaps just feel you need to go on to the next step. That's all from me. Thanks for listening. As always, please just leave your comments or any questions below in the comments. Please do subscribe to our Evogo YouTube channel as well, and also hit the bell icon so you will be notified of any new videos. Thanks.